good games, there are bad games, and there are ugly games. Are there ugly games? Yeah, there are definitely ugly games. A really particularly bad game, though, can be so bad it's not just bad in its own right. It can actually result in it killing off other games, and in the worst cases, entire studios. It's a rare occurrence, but it does sprout up every now and then. There are these games that bomb so hard they either impact the success of a follow-up, cause a publisher to lose faith in the IP, order sequel development to cease, or in the worst cases, as we said, kill off the studio that made it entirely. These games we have on this list are the worst examples. Games that absolutely sunk like the Titanic, and just like a black hole, dragged everything down along with them. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games so bad they killed other games. Number 10, Dino Crisis 3. The crash and burn of the Dino Crisis franchise is infamous among Capcom fans. One of the all-time great self-destructions of a once great cult classic game series, and it's all thanks to the broken slog that was Dino Crisis 3. Now, the Dino Crisis series was Capcom's other survival horror series that ran alongside Resident Evil. While it had, and still has, its fans, it always struggled to establish its own identity besides Resident Evil, but now the pretty woman is shooting at dinosaurs. If it had worked, Dino Crisis 3's more sci-fi and action-heavy approach would have been the shot in the arm it needed to go mainstream, but unfortunately that is not what happened. Instead, Dino Crisis 3 was an unmitigated disaster. It was a classic example of ambition that massively exceeded the ability to pull it off. Useless weapons, overpowered enemies, environments that are way too damn large, topped with easily one of the worst cameras in gaming history. Naturally, Dino Crisis 3 killed the franchise dead. We know very little about Dino Crisis 4, but we do know that it was in development around the time that 3 was released, only of course to be swiftly cancelled thanks to the critical and financial thrashing that 3 received. Number 9, Haze. Now, we know that lackluster sales can hurt an entire studio's output going forward. Even if the game itself isn't that bad, if sales are really bad, it can make publishers lose faith in the studio's ability to pull games off. Enter Free Radical and their 2008 bomb Haze. Poor Free Radical had been getting by up until then with the cult classic Time Splitters trilogy, with a long-awaited fourth entry ready to set off down the pipeline. But before they did that, Free Radical decided to release a new project dubbed Haze. Meant as the studio's answer to Halo, Haze embodied everything emblematic of first-person shooters of the mid-2000s. Sadly, that wasn't enough, and Haze bombed hard. Free Radical was in dire straits after that, and Time Splitters 4 was unable to get off the ground, as Free Radical was unable to secure a publisher for years. That was until they were bought up by the current, oh god them again, of the gaming news cycle, Embracer Group. At first, that seemed like a godsend. Free Radical was saved, and Time Splitters 4 along with it. But then, Embracer-owned publisher PlayOn announced that they would be closing down Free Radical, and Time Splitters 4 went along with it. Number 8, Gollum. When Embracer studio Daedalic bought the rights to make a Lord of the Rings game starring Gollum, Embracer Group saw this as just the beginning of a long, lucrative relationship with the IP. Unfortunately, this, much like the last instance that included Embracer, would entirely blow up in their faces as Gollum came out and proved to be just about the worst gaming experience of the year. And probably the year before that, and maybe the year before that as well. Now, I'm a Daedalic apologist. Daedalic do incredible point-and-click adventure games, but what they don't do is the kind of game that Gollum was going to be, so it's just a shame all around. The horrific love child of Embracer's terrible management and Daedalic not having the skill or manpower to match their ambition, Gollum is almost indescribably bad. Another Middle-earth game was released later that year, Return to Moria, but due to a combination of its own shortcomings and, being associated with Gollum, that game bombed as well. On top of that, any Middle-earth projects that Embracer had in the pipeline was swiftly cancelled after Gollum dropped. Gollum was just a disaster from top to bottom. It seemed like every single link in the chain was broken. A publisher who didn't know quite what was going on with the IP, and a developer without the experience in that specific genre to pull it off. It is, as I said, a massive shame, and unfortunately, Gollum has now become just a meme. Number 7, Epic Mickey 2, The Power of Two.
The power of
The Epic Mickey series came to a screeching halt in 2012 with the release of Epic Mickey 2: The Power of Two. While not the worst thing in the world, the game did little to improve on the problems present in the first game. Add on to that some truly abysmal AI, and you get a game that was met with, at best, lukewarm critical and financial reception. But Junction Point Studios were not to be deterred. They were already working on a follow-up called Epic Donald. However, the reception to Epic Mickey 2, as well as shifting priorities for their games going forward, compelled Disney to pull the plug on the franchise. Maybe if Epic Mickey 2 was better, Disney would have held on, maybe not, but Epic Mickey 2 stopped a once promising idea dead in its tracks. Number 6. Marvel's Avengers. No live service siren song has led to rockier shores than that of Avengers. The whole idea was a mistake from minute one. Pitching an Avengers game at the height of the MCU's popularity only to make it a live service game is the kind of plan that only sounds good to the kinds of NBA losers who make all the decisions nowadays, apparently. In practice, Avengers was an absolute and total disaster that backfired on Marvel and Square Enix hard. So thick and pungent was the stench coming off this game that unless it was Insomniac's Spider-Man, few were interested in other Marvel video game projects. This was what befell Eidos Montreal's Guardians of the Galaxy. A superior game to Avengers in every single retrospect, GOTG was nonetheless caught up in the fallout, tanking in sales due to sheer association. Guardians of the Galaxy deserved so much more than it got, being absolutely sent out to die just because of the reputation of a completely different game. Number 5. Tomb Raider: Angel of Darkness. There was a brief time when the Tomb Raider franchise was slotted into the yearly release model, being a model that's basically doomed to producing lower quality games, as the dev team has to cut corners after corners to make deadlines. So it came as no surprise that this era of Tomb Raider crashed and burned with Tomb Raider: Angel of Darkness. Widely considered to be one of the worst Tomb Raider games ever made, this was absolutely a victim of that yearly format, which was completely incompatible with the type of games that Tomb Raider were. Primitive controls, an abundance of glitches, and the lack of any checkpoint system for reasons unknown, core design was stretched incredibly thin during the development of AOD, and it shows in the final product. Angel of Darkness was very nearly the death knell of the entire franchise, with core design going under in the wake of its failure and taking all the planned sequels to AOD with it. Angel of Darkness was meant to bring Tomb Raider into the PS2 era, but instead of doing that, it took the franchise's gravy train and ran it straight into a ravine. Number 4. Sonic and the Black Knight. The Sonic Storybook series was an interesting experiment on Sega's part, dedicating an entire spin-off series to exploring how motion controls can be implemented into the Sonic formula using the framework of Sonic exploring different public domain stories to justify it narratively is pretty interesting. But it seemed super interesting, and then Sonic and the Black Knight came out. The thing is, Black Knight isn't even that bad. The story is one of the best in the franchise, the sword mechanics had a lot of promise, and that soundtrack is absolutely sublime. But unfortunately, it hadn't 100% nailed down the formula. Combat was too stiff, motion controls, while improved, were still pretty unwieldy, and the level design still needed work. And with this being Sega's do everything once and then never again era, that spelled the doom for this branch of the franchise. The worst part of this though is that there was very clearly more interest from both fans and the Sonic team to create more games of this ilk. Shortly after Black Knight came out, a Facebook poll was posted by Sega asking what setting fans would like to see in the next storybook entry, with Greek mythology winning out. That poll has since been deleted as the fate of the storybook series was decided. Number 3. Ride to Hell: Retribution. Commonly considered to be one of the worst video games ever made, Ride to Hell: Retribution launched to lots of disdain from both critics and people at large for being, well, it's just crap at everything, just pretty much all the things. It's genuinely difficult to think of one thing this game doesn't screw up, but you don't need me to tell you that when much bigger guys like Scott the Woz and Yahtzee have taken this thing to task. So let's get down to the point. Eutechnyx and Deep Silver wanted Ride to Hell to be a flagship franchise, in the same vein as Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto series. So in a classic case of running before you know how to walk, they had 2 spin-off games in the works, Ride to Hell Route 666 and Ride to Hell Beatdown. One for Xbox Live and the other for mobile. Needless to say, neither saw the light of day. It turns out when you create what is considered to be one of the worst examples of a piece of media within that medium, it sort of kills off anybody's investment to want to see more from you. Number 2, Too Human. How ironic that a game that Silicon Knights moved heaven and earth for years on end to get released would be the one to destroy them in the end. Maybe if their original deal with Nintendo back in the 90s had gone through, things might have been different, but that's not how this story plays out. Too Human is considered one of the worst games of its generation for a bunch of different reasons. It has a pretty nothing story, a baffling combat system, and stiff controls. But the biggest mark of infamy to this game's name is that, as mentioned above, it killed Silicon Knights and every game they were making. Well, that wasn't just due to the game's lackluster sales, but also because their partner, Epic Games, discovered that Silicon Knights had plagiarized multiple lines of their developer code. Naturally, Silicon Knights were dragged to court over this breach of their contract, and Epic won, ordering that all copies of both Too Human and SK's other big release at the time, X-Men Destiny, be destroyed. Silicon Knights closed shortly thereafter, taking all of the games they were working on down with them. Too Human killed its studio, every single other game that was being worked on by its studio, and itself. So with a casualty list that long, what could possibly top it? If you know, you know, and if you don't, I'm about to tell you. Number 1, E.T. Nothing can really top the failure of Too Human apart from a game that was such a dismal failure, it almost killed off the entirety of the industry while it was in its crib. 1983 is a year that will forever live in infamy among gamers. Atari and the other studios that represented the first wave of video game development had flooded the market with a truly sinful glut of video games, the lion's share of which were not very good. Frankly, the whole thing was a powder keg waiting to blow, with every game released playing the part of someone lighting a cigar right next to it. One of them was bound to be the one, capital T, capital O. And that fate fell upon poor E.T. for the Atari 2600. Although, how bad you want to feel for it is entirely up to you. With one poor son of a gun forced to construct the whole thing in just a few weeks to meet the Christmas deadline, what came out that year feels inevitable looking back. E.T. was such a poorly made, cobbled together mess that the fallout of its release crashed the entire market, killing multiple studios and games still in development, and those that were lucky to come out bombed hard financially. While the story about crap tons of E.T. copies being buried in the desert turned out to be a little bit of an urban legend based on some truth, but not nearly as much as we'd thought, there's definitely a grounding here for a game that was absolutely the worst thing that could have happened to this industry. So naturally, it has to top our list. Still feel bad for that developer though.